I never thought the ride home from the hospital would be the loneliest journey of my life. My name is Helen, I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in the same white-painted farmhouse on the outskirts of Bangor, Maine, for nearly 50 years. I've seen winters that could freeze the Penobscot River solid and summers that smelled of pine and sea breeze, but nothing prepared me for the chill I felt that spring afternoon when I stepped out of the hospital doors, leaning on a cane, and realized no one was waiting for me. A week earlier, I'd undergone hip surgery after a fall on the back steps. The doctors told me I'd heal well if I followed the therapy schedule. I believed them until the moment I looked around the hospital parking lot with my discharge papers in hand, and saw only strangers getting into their cars. My son, Daniel, had promised he'd be there by noon. He was the only family I had left. My husband, Walter, passed away 5 years ago, and my daughter moved to Oregon long ago, too busy with her own world. Daniel was supposed to be my anchor. I tried to stay calm, telling myself he was just running late. I sat on the bench near the entrance, watching the revolving door swish open and shut. The breeze carried the scent of wet pavement and spring rain. An hour passed. My phone stayed silent. I called him 3 times. Each time it went to voicemail. The nurse on duty noticed me waiting and asked if everything was all right. I smiled politely, hiding the lump in my throat, and said my son was on his way. Inside, I felt small, like a forgotten parcel. Another hour slipped by. I thought of the promise Daniel had made the night before my surgery. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll be there when you wake up and when it's time to take you home." I'd clung to those words through the sterile smell of the hospital and the long, sleepless nights. Now they rang hollow. At 72, you don't expect grand gestures, but you do expect your child to remember you. By the 3rd hour, I couldn't wait any longer. The nurse suggested I call a cab, but I knew the trip back to the farmhouse would cost more than I was willing to spend, especially after the medical bills. I stared at the row of cars parked near the hospital lot and felt a stubborn spark ignite in me, an old independence I hadn't felt since my younger days on the farm. I decided I wouldn't wait for anyone to rescue me. The rental car counter at the nearby travel kiosk smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The young man behind the desk raised his eyebrows at me as I approached, leaning heavily on my cane. "Need a ride, ma'am?" he asked with a polite smile. I told him I needed a car. He hesitated, clearly wondering if a woman of my age, barely out of surgery, should be driving. I assured him I could handle it. Inside, my heart fluttered with a mix of fear and determination. I hadn't driven in nearly a year since my hip began bothering me. The car they gave me was a small silver sedan that smelled faintly of pine-scented air freshener. Sliding into the driver's seat was slow and painful, but I felt a strange surge of pride as I adjusted the mirrors and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, and for a moment, the world outside the disappointment, the empty promises fell away. I was in control again. However, briefly. The road from the hospital wound through patches of misty woods and open stretches of highway. Dark clouds hung low over the horizon, threatening rain again. I drove carefully, every bump in the road reminding me of my healing hip. Memories drifted in with the smell of damp pine. Daniel as a boy riding beside me in our old truck, his legs too short to reach the floor, singing along to the radio. Where had that boy gone? When had the distance between us become so wide that he could forget his own mother at the hospital curb? I reached the farmhouse just as the first raindrop splashed against the windshield. The white paint on the porch was peeling, and the lilac bushes Walter planted decades ago were just beginning to bloom. I parked the rental car by the barn and sat for a moment, staring at the house that had held my whole life inside its walls. A hollow ache settled in my chest, not just from the surgery, but from the realization that coming home no longer felt like being cared for. It felt like returning to an empty shell. Inside the house smelled of old wood and faint lavender. I left my cane by the door, careful to balance against the wall as I stepped into the kitchen. A note lay on the table, in Daniel's rushed handwriting. "Had to run errands. Will call later." No apology, no explanation. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling the sting of betrayal deepen. He had known I'd be coming home today. Errands had come first. The rain picked up, drumming on the roof as I settled into the worn armchair in the living room, exhausted. The rental car keys rested in my palm like a small symbol of defiance. I should have been angry, but mostly I felt something heavier, grief for the family ties that had frayed over the years without me noticing. I wondered what Walter would have said if he were still alive. He had always believed Daniel had a good heart, just needed guidance. Now, I wasn't so sure. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. I watched the lightning flicker beyond the lace curtains and thought about calling my daughter, but I knew she'd be asleep 3 time zones away. I didn't want to wake her with my troubles. I told myself I'd talk to Daniel when he came by, demand an explanation. Deep down, though, I sensed that the story behind his absence was more complicated than a forgotten promise. That night, as the storm rattled the windows and the old farmhouse creaked like it remembered every past winter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just disappointment in Daniel, it was the uneasy sense that I had crossed the threshold. Driving myself home from the hospital felt like reclaiming something, but also like stepping into a new chapter I hadn't chosen. I didn't know it then, but the drive was only the beginning. The real storm was still on its way, and it had nothing to do with the weather. The storm carried on through the night, but what really kept me awake wasn't the thunder. It was the silence of the house, thick, heavy, the kind that presses on your chest. Walter's old clock ticked unevenly in the hallway, like it had developed a limp. Every sound made me jump. I tried to sleep sitting up in my chair because climbing the stairs felt too risky with my hips still tender. The glow from the old brass lamp barely reached the corners of the living room. The rain had cooled the air and made it smell earthy, almost metallic. I sat there wrapped in an old quilt, staring at the front door, as though Daniel might walk through it any minute. I waited for the phone to ring. It never did. I finally dozed off, only to wake at dawn to the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. My heart leapt. I hurried as best as I could, wincing at the ache in my side. When I opened the door, I didn't see Daniel. Instead, a brown delivery truck was pulling away, leaving a package on the porch. For a moment, I thought it might be from him, maybe a peace offering. I stepped outside carefully and bent down to check the label. Just a box of household supplies I'd ordered online weeks ago. I went back inside, more weary than before. I boiled water for tea, letting the familiar routine calm me. The sun was just breaking through the clouds, throwing streaks of pale gold through the kitchen window, lighting up the old wallpaper Walter always swore he'd replace but never did. It hit me then how long it had been since I'd felt at home in my own house. At 9:30, my phone finally rang. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity overpowered my pride. "Hi, Mom," he said casually, as though we hadn't missed each other entirely the day before. I clenched the edge of the counter. "Daniel, you forgot me at the hospital." There was a pause, just long enough for me to know he'd been caught off guard. "Oh yeah, I'm sorry about that. Something came up." My voice trembled despite my efforts to keep it even. "I was sitting outside the hospital for hours. I know, I should have called." His tone softened, almost pleading. "Work's been crazy. The boss moved up the deadline for a project. I couldn't get away." I wanted to believe him. He sounded genuine, but something about the way he rushed through the explanation felt off. "You could have at least called," I said quietly. He sighed. "You're right, I should have. I'll come by tonight to check on you." I ended the call with a polite goodbye, but my chest still felt heavy. I thought of the boy who used to run through the lilac bushes, always eager to help me with chores. Where had that boy gone? Somewhere between those summers and now, we'd become strangers who happened to share blood. I spent the rest of the morning trying to busy myself watering the house, sorting through the mail, even though it hurt to move. Around noon, I found a letter from the insurance company, reminding me about pending payments for my surgery. I set it aside with a sigh. Money had always been a delicate subject in this house, especially after Walter's passing. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again, threatening more rain. I made a simple dinner soup from a can and buttered bread and waited. Daniel didn't show up. At 8:30, I sent him a short text asking if he was still coming. An hour passed. No reply. I went to the front window and looked out at the driveway. The rental car sat there, silver and neat, a silent witness to my disappointment. The porch light flickered in the breeze. I felt like a character in someone else's story, watching my life unfold as if from a distance. It was nearly 10:30 when I finally saw headlights approach, relief mixed with resentment as Daniel's dark SUV came up the drive. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, as he stepped out carrying a grocery bag. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," he said, his voice a little too cheerful. "I brought you some things: milk, bread, a few apples." I took the bag from him without a smile. "Thank you," I said flatly. Inside, he set down his keys and glanced around the living room like he hadn't been there in ages. "Place looks good," he said. I studied him for a moment. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his chin, but there was also something restless about him, as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. Daniel, I said gently, I don't want to fight, but I need to know what's going on. Yesterday wasn't just about work, was it? He avoided my gaze, pretending to straighten a stack of magazines on the coffee table. It's nothing, Mom. Really. Just a rough couple of days. I didn't push, though my gut told me he wasn't telling me everything. Instead, I poured us both tea and we sat in awkward silence, broken only by the clink of our spoons. I wanted to bridge the gap between us, to ask about his life, his work, even his girlfriend, but I didn't know where to start. When he left an hour later, promising to visit again soon, the house felt even emptier than before. I watched his taillights disappear down the long gravel road, and the thought lodged itself in my mind. Something was wrong, and he didn't trust me enough to tell me. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I heard the wind rattle the old windows and thought about Walter, about how he always said, "Storms pass, Helen, you just have to hold steady." I tried to hold steady, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I told myself it was just the disappointment of the last 2 days, but deep down I knew it was more than that. The silence between Daniel and me wasn't just distance, it was hiding something. As I lay awake, I promised myself I'd find out what it was, if not for my own peace of mind, then for the memory of the man who built this home with me, brick by brick. The next morning, sunlight crept through the thin curtains, spilling across the kitchen table where I sat with a cup of tea gone cold. My mind wandered to the years when mornings were busy, when Daniel was still a boy rushing to catch the school bus, when Walter read the newspaper aloud, commenting on politics between bites of toast. Now the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. I decided to keep myself occupied. There was a certain comfort in chores, even when my hip protested. I vacuumed the living room rug, dusted the mantel where Walter's photograph sat, his eyes forever bright behind the glass. I lingered on that picture a little longer than usual. You'd know what to say to him, I murmured to it. The house answered with silence. By noon, I baked a small batch of blueberry muffins, Daniel's favorite when he was a kid. I thought it might be a peace offering, a way to soften the tension from last night. As the smell of baked berries filled the kitchen, I checked my phone for any messages from him. Nothing. I called anyway. The line rang until it went to voicemail. I left a cheerful message. Hey Daniel, I made muffins. Stop by if you have time. I tried to sound light, but there was a crack in my voice. I hoped he wouldn't notice. The afternoon stretched on. I busied myself with folding laundry and rearranging the plants in the sunroom. Around 3 o'clock, I heard the crunch of tires in the driveway again. My heart lifted, but when I peeked through the lace curtain, it wasn't Daniel. It was a woman stepping out of a gray sedan, a stranger. She carried a clipboard and a small tote bag slung over her shoulder. I opened the door cautiously. Can I help you? She smiled warmly. Mrs. Harris, I'm Claire. I'm from the visiting nurse service. The hospital sent me to check in on you after your surgery. Relief and a touch of embarrassment washed over me. Oh, of course. Please, come in. Claire had a calm, efficient air about her. She checked my vitals, asked about the pain in my hip, and complimented my muffins. There was something soothing about her presence, professional but kind, the way good nurses often are. Before she left, she looked at me with a slight frown. Do you have someone staying with you, Mrs. Harris? You really shouldn't be alone too much right now. I hesitated before answering. My son. He visits, but he's busy. Her frown deepened for a heartbeat, then softened again. Well, I'll be stopping by twice a week. If you need anything in between, don't hesitate to call the number on this card. She handed it to me with a reassuring smile. After she left, the house seemed to sink back into its usual stillness, but now it felt less oppressive, as if her brief visit had stirred a bit of life into it. I decided to call Daniel again, but this time it went straight to voicemail. A little knot of worry tightened in my stomach. I told myself he was just caught up with work again, yet the thought didn't comfort me as much as it had yesterday. Around 5 in the evening, just as I was taking the muffins out of the oven to warm them for dinner, I heard the door creak open. Daniel stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Hey Mom, he said, forcing a smile. Smells good in here. I offered him a plate. Blueberry muffins. Remember how you used to sneak the warm ones when you were little? His smile became more genuine for a moment, but it faded quickly. He sat down at the kitchen table and picked at the edge of the muffin instead of eating it. I sat opposite him. You didn't answer my calls today. Yeah, Sorry. Busy day at work, he said again, avoiding my eyes. I studied him carefully. You've been busy a lot lately. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. I know, things are just complicated right now. Complicated how? I asked softly. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His shoulders slumped, and he looked like a boy again, burdened by something he couldn't quite name. Finally he said, I don't want to worry you. Daniel, I'm your mother. You're supposed to worry me if something's wrong. He gave a half laugh that didn't reach his eyes. It's nothing serious. Just some bills piling up and a few personal issues. I reached across the table and touched his hand. You don't have to handle everything alone. He pulled his hand back gently. I'll figure it out. I always do. There was a finality in his tone that told me he wouldn't say more, at least not tonight. I let it go, but unease lingered between us like a shadow. After dinner, he said he had to leave early to catch up on work emails. I walked him to the door, watching as he drove off again. The rental car's headlights flickered in the dark as I stood there until they vanished. That night, while I was closing the curtains, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under the front doormat. Curious, I bent down to pick it up. It was an overdue notice from the power company, addressed to Daniel's apartment. He must have dropped it by accident. I held the letter in my hand for a long time, 100 questions swirling in my mind, bills piling up, personal issues. His words came back to me with new weight. I realized then that his distance wasn't just emotional. He was carrying burdens I hadn't known about. I placed the letter on the mantel beneath Walter's photo. Looks like he's got himself in a bit of a storm, I whispered to the photograph. Walter's eyes in the picture seemed to look back at me knowingly. The wind outside rattled the branches against the windows, and the old house creaked as if shifting in its sleep. I made a silent vow. I wouldn't just sit back and watch things fall apart. Daniel might have drifted away from me over the years, but I wasn't going to let him drown without reaching out a hand. With that thought, I climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the banister for balance. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of purpose, something more than just waiting for the phone to ring. The following morning, the sky was low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I made myself a modest breakfast, just oatmeal, and Tian stared at the overdue notice on the mantel while I ate. I couldn't stop thinking about it. How long had Daniel been struggling without saying a word? After washing the dishes, I decided I couldn't sit idle. I dialed Daniel's number again. It rang twice before he answered. His voice clipped, but polite. Hey, Mom, everything okay? Yes, dear. I found a letter on the porch yesterday, looked like a bill for your apartment. There was a pause. Oh yeah, must have fallen out of my jacket. I'm handling it. Daniel, are you in trouble? You can talk to me. Another pause, longer this time. I've got it under control, Mom. Please don't worry. But of course, that's exactly what I did. After we hung up, I called Claire, the visiting nurse. She had mentioned being able to arrange some support services if needed. I'm fine physically, I told her, but I'm a little worried about my son. I don't know how to help him without pushing him away. She listened patiently before saying, sometimes people hide their struggles because they're ashamed. He might just need to know you're there when he's ready to talk. That afternoon, I decided to do something small but meaningful. I baked a chicken pot pie, the kind Daniel loved as a boy, and planned to drop it off at his apartment. The rain had started by the time I drove into town, streaking across the windshield of the rental car. His apartment building was an older brick complex on the edge of town. I parked under a swaying maple tree and carried the covered dish up the narrow stairs. His door was slightly ajar. I hesitated before knocking. Daniel, I called softly. Got no answer. I pushed the door open a little further. The living room lights were on, and the place smelled faintly of damp carpet and old coffee. On the coffee table lay a pile of unopened envelopes, more overdue notices, some with bright red final warning stamps across them. My heart sank. Just then, I heard the rattle of keys at the door. Daniel stepped in, startled to see me standing there with the pie in my hands. Mom, what are you doing here? I wanted to bring you dinner, I said gently. But, Daniel, what's going on here? I nodded toward the stack of bills. He closed the door slowly, his expression guarded. It's just a rough patch. I didn't want you to see this. I set the pie on the counter and turned to him. You've been carrying this alone, haven't you? He sighed heavily and sank into the sagging couch. After Laura left, things went downhill. I tried to keep up with the rent, the car payments, but work's been slow. I thought I'd bounce back before anyone noticed. I sat beside him, my hands folded in my lap. You should have told me. I didn't want to worry you, especially with your surgery. We sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping steadily against the window. I wanted to reach out, to hold his hand, but something in his posture told me he wasn't ready for comfort yet. Finally, I said, "You've always been the boy who wanted to protect me, but sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let someone help you back." His eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked away the tears. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mon." I squeezed his shoulder. "We'll figure it out, together." When I left his apartment that evening, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I had glimpsed his struggles, but I sensed there was more to the story, something he hadn't said. On the drive home, the rain turned into a downpour, making the roads slick and the headlights blurry. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my thoughts churning as fast as the wipers moved. At home, I changed into my nightrobe and settled into the armchair near the fireplace. Staring at the flames as they licked the logs, I replayed our conversation over and over, searching for hints in his words. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, soft, almost like footsteps on wet leaves. My pulse quickened. I pulled the curtains back just enough to peek out into the dark yard. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, half shrouded by the rain and shadows. It looked like a man in a hooded jacket, standing still, facing the house. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone, vanished into the night. I told myself it was just a trick of the rain and the dim porch light, but the image of that lone figure lingered in my mind as I went to bed. The next morning, I found wet footprints on the porch that didn't match my own. I crouched down on the porch that morning, my fingers brushing against the damp footprints. They were larger than mine, the edges blurred by the rain but still visible, leading from the driveway to the porch and back again, as if someone had approached the door and then changed their mind. A ripple of unease passed through me. I tried to reason it away. Perhaps it was just a passerby cutting across the yard during the storm. But why stop here? Why stand in the rain outside my house at midnight? After breakfast, I called Daniel. "Did you come by the house last night?" He sounded surprised. "No, I worked late and went straight home." "No reason," I lied, unwilling to worry him. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house, usually a comfort, suddenly felt too quiet. I checked the locks twice, drew the curtains tight, and kept the porch light on even in daylight. Claire, the visiting nurse, arrived in the afternoon for her scheduled visit. She immediately noticed my tense demeanor. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Harris?" she asked while unpacking her kit. I hesitated, then decided to confide in her. "I thought I saw someone outside last night, and there were footprints on the porch this morning." Claire's brow furrowed. "Did you call the police?" I didn't want to bother them over what might have been nothing. "Well," she said gently but firmly, "it's always better to be safe. I can call the non-emergency line for you." I promised I would if it happened again, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. Later that evening, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He seemed more relaxed than the day before, almost buoyed by something. "I got a call about a job interview tomorrow," he said with a tentative smile. "That's wonderful news," I replied, genuinely pleased. "You'll do great." He stayed for dinner, and for a little while, things felt almost normal. We laughed over old stories, how he once tried to build a treehouse that collapsed before he could climb it, how Walter used to pretend to lose at checkers just to see him grin. But when I mentioned the footprints, his smile faded. "You should have told me right away. I'll drive by tonight after my interview prep, just to check the place out." I nodded, grateful for his concern. Still, I couldn't ignore the way his eyes shifted slightly when I described the figure in the rain, almost as if he suspected something or someone. That night, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and damp. I sat by the window, peering out at the moonlit driveway. No figure appeared. Just as I was about to head upstairs, I heard a faint metallic clink outside, near the back gate. My breath caught. I grabbed the small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept to the back door, my heart hammering. Through the narrow window on the door, I could see the gate swinging slightly, as if it had just been pushed open. I turned the deadbolt quickly and stepped back, debating whether to call Daniel or the police. The phone in my pocket buzzed just then. It was a text message from an unknown number. "We should talk. I know what your son is hiding." The words sent a chill straight down my spine. I stared at the message, rereading it over and over. Who would send such a thing? And what could Daniel possibly be hiding that someone else would know about? I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay awake listening to every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside, the shadows on the ceiling seemed to move with the moonlight. By morning, I decided to tell Daniel about the message. I called him as soon as I heard his voice on the other end. Daniel, I got a strange text last night from an unknown number. They said they know what you're hiding. Silence. Daniel, when he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. Mom, don't reply to that message. And don't tell anyone else. Please, I'll explain everything after my interview today. I promise. Daniel, you're scaring me. I'll come over tonight. We'll talk then. Just stay inside until I get there. The line went dead before I could say another word. I felt torn between waiting for him and calling the authorities, but the sound of his voice, the urgency in it, convinced me to wait at least until evening. As the day wore on, the sky darkened again, heavy clouds rolling in from the coast. The air smelled of an oncoming storm. I brewed tea, trying to calm my nerves, but the tea turned cold in the cup as I sat staring at the clock. The evening came, 6 o'clock passed, then 7. Daniel still hadn't arrived. At 7:45, the front porch light flickered, the wind rattled the window. I thought I saw a shadow cross the yard, but when I looked again, it was gone. A knock sounded on the door, soft, deliberate. I approached slowly, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. Who is it? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. I froze by the door, the silence after that second knock stretching out like a taut wire. The porch light flickered again, casting long, uneasy shadows across the hallway walls. My fingers hovered over the deadbolt, unsure whether to turn it. Who's there? I asked again, louder this time. Still no answer. A memory of the text message flashed through my mind. I know what your son is hiding. I stepped back from the door, heart hammering. The third knock came, slower and heavier, as if the visitor knew I was standing right there. Suddenly my phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled to answer it without taking my eyes off the door. Mom, it's me, Daniel's voice said, slightly breathless. Don't open the door. I'm 5 minutes away. Just stay inside. My pulse raced. Daniel, there's someone knocking. Listen to me. He cut in sharply, more urgently than I'd ever heard him before. Do not open it until I get there. The line went dead again. I backed away from the door, retreating to the kitchen where I grabbed the heavy iron skillet I kept on the stove just in case. My hands trembled as I clutched it to my chest. The knocks stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear if the person had left, but all I caught was the distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the coast. A flash of headlights swept across the living room window a few minutes later. Daniel's car. Relief flooded me so fast my knees went weak. I rushed to unlock the door just as he bounded up the steps. He looked soaked from the rain that had begun to fall again, his hair plastered to his forehead. Are you okay? He asked, scanning me quickly before glancing over his shoulder at the dark yard. I'm fine, I said, though my voice betrayed the tremor still lingering in my chest. But who was that? Who's been coming here? He shut the door behind him and locked it, then drew the curtains tight. It's complicated, he said, his jaw tightening. I set the skillet down on the counter. Then make it uncomplicated. I deserve to know. He sank into the armchair near the fireplace, rain dripping from his jacket onto the old rug. A few months ago, I borrowed money from someone I shouldn't have. I thought it would help me catch up on bills after the divorce, but it only made things worse. I've been paying bits back whenever I can, but now they're threatening me. My stomach nodded. Daniel, you're telling me someone dangerous is coming to my house? I never thought they'd come here, he said, his voice breaking with frustration. I've been trying to keep you out of it. That text you got, someone's trying to scare you to get to me. I sat down slowly across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. You should have told me sooner. I didn't want you to worry, he said softly. You've already been through enough with the surgery and everything. We sat in heavy silence for a few moments, the sound of rain pattering against the windows filling the room. Finally, I said, we need to go to the police tonight. He shook his head. They won't do anything unless something happens, and I don't want this getting uglier than it already is. The wind howled outside, rattling the porch light as it flickered once more. Daniel glanced toward the window and lowered his voice. I think they're watching us. I noticed a car following me here tonight. A chill went through me. The idea that someone might be lurking out there in the storm made the house feel smaller, the shadows deeper. Maybe we should stay somewhere else, I suggested. A hotel, just for tonight. Daniel shook his head again. No, running will only make it worse. I need to face them. but I have to figure out how. I owe them money I don't have. I reached out and put a hand over his. You're not alone in this anymore. We'll figure it out together. He managed a faint, grateful smile. You always say that. Thunder cracked loudly enough to make the windows vibrate, and for a split second, the lights went out before flickering back on. I stood up to make more tea, partly to calm myself, partly to give us both something warm in our hands. When I returned to the living room, Daniel was staring into the fire, his face drawn and tired. Do you think they'll come back tonight? I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. I don't know, he admitted finally, but I think we should be ready just in case. I set the tea down and sat back in my chair, watching the rain streak down the window. The night stretched on, long and heavy with the weight of things unsaid. It was nearly midnight when Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, read the message, and his face went pale. I leaned forward. What is it? He turned the screen so I could see. You have until tomorrow night to pay up, or your mother finds out the rest. I looked at him, bewildered. The rest? What else aren't you telling me? He ran a hand over his face. It's not just about the money. I think they know something I was trying to keep buried. My voice barely rose above a whisper. What could possibly be worse than this? He didn't answer. I stared at Daniel, searching his face for a hint of what he meant, but he avoided my eyes. The firelight flickered across his features, deepening the shadows under his eyes. Daniel, I said softly but firmly, I've stood by you through every scrape and storm since you were a boy. Whatever it is, I can handle it. Tell me. His hands tightened around the phone. It's about the loan. I didn't just borrow from one man. I signed over collateral, something I shouldn't have. My chest tightened. What did you put up as collateral? He hesitated before answering. The house, our family home. They have a paper saying if I don't pay in full by tomorrow night, they can claim it. For a heartbeat, I couldn't speak. My eyes darted around the living room, the mantel with Walter's photo, the worn rug Daniel once played on as a child, the creaky stairs that had carried generations of footsteps. This house was more than timber and nails. It was every memory we had left of Walter, of our life together. You mortgaged the house to a loan shark. My voice cracked. I was desperate, he said, the words tumbling out. After the divorce, I couldn't keep up with everything. I thought I'd catch up before it came to this. I never imagined they'd come knocking on your door. I pressed a hand to my temple, the room tilting slightly as the weight of it sank in. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I was ashamed, he whispered. We sat in silence, the storm outside rattling the windows as if the world itself was restless. Finally, I stood, my resolve solidifying. We can't let them take the house. We'll go to the police. We'll explain everything. Daniel shook his head. If we involve the police, they'll retaliate. These aren't men who back down. They'll make us pay in other ways. Before I could respond, headlights swept across the front windows, again too slow to be just a passing car. Daniel stood up, his jaw tightening. They're here. A car door slammed outside. Then, another. We both moved to the window, peering through the edge of the curtain. Two men stood at the bottom of the porch steps, their jackets pulled tight against the rain. One of them raised his fist and pounded on the door. Daniel, a rough voice called. We know you're in there. Time's up. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911, but Daniel caught my wrist gently. Wait, let me handle this. I shook my head, whispering fiercely. They won't reason with you. Another round of pounding shook the door, more urgent this time. Open up, or we'll make you. Daniel opened the door just a crack, keeping his body between me and the strangers. I just need more time, he said, his voice steady but low. The taller man leaned forward, his face partly shadowed by the porch light. Time's the one thing you don't have. We're not here to chat. I stepped forward despite Daniel's attempt to hold me back. My voice, though trembling, carried the weight of years. This is my home. You have no right to threaten us. The man's gaze flicked to me, then back to Daniel. You didn't tell her, did you? Shame. She deserves to know what kind of mess her son's in. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. Leave her out of this. The shorter man chuckled darkly. Pay up by tomorrow, or we come back to collect the house. He tapped the porch railing with a gloved finger before turning toward the steps. And next time, we won't be so polite. They left as abruptly as they'd come, their car's taillights vanishing into the storm. The moment the sound of their engine faded, Daniel shut the door and locked it, leaning against it as though to keep the entire world out. I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling his tremble beneath my palm. We're going to the police in the morning, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "We can't fight men like that alone." Daniel nodded reluctantly, his shoulders sagging in defeat. We didn't sleep much that night. I sat awake in the living room, watching the flames die down in the fireplace, while Daniel dozed fitfully in the chair opposite me. Each creak of the house kept me on edge. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean but eerily still. We drove into town together as soon as the police station opened. The officer who listened to our story, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, took our statements seriously. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "We've been keeping tabs on this crew. We'll send a patrol car by your place tonight, just in case." Relief mingled with the lingering anxiety in my chest. For the first time in days, I felt like we weren't facing this alone. Back at the house, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said finally, "for everything, for forgetting you at the hospital, for dragging you into this. I never meant for things to get this bad." I reached over and took his hand in mine. "You're my son. We've both made mistakes, but we face them together. That's what family does." Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time in years, he let me pull him into a hug. That evening, as the sun set over the wet streets of our little Maine town, a patrol car idled at the end of the driveway. The house was quiet again, but now it felt less like a trap and more like a refuge. As we sat by the fire, I realized that the storm, the real storm, hadn't been the men at the door, or even the threat to the house. It had been the distance that had grown between us over the years, a distance built on pride and silence. And in facing this threat together, we had begun to bridge that gap. I glanced at Walter's photo on the mantel, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long while. "We'll be all right," I whispered, as though he could hear me. Daniel nodded, almost as if he'd heard it too.